In this video, you will learn all the controls you will generally see on a reverb. Different reverbs will definitely have different setups, but overall, they'll have the same controls or related controls. So let's take a look. Please smash that like button and subscribe. I've got an instance of Valhalla Vintage Verb open on some vocals. We'll go over all these controls left to right. And if you look here on the bottom, when I hover my mouse over a control, it'll tell you what it is. So if at any point you feel the need to, please pause or rewind so you can go back, look, and read for extra context to anything we're talking about. First thing we have is mix. This is going to be the difference between your wet and dry. If you don't know what wet and dry is, dry means unaffected and unchanged signal, whereas wet means the changed signal. You will see the word mix to represent the mix between these two signals. So if I go all the way left to 0%, baby, it pours back to you. All dry signal. To the right all the way, baby, it pours back to you. That is our reverb only. This will become more apparent if I boost the decay. Baby, it pours back to you. And then we have somewhere in the middle where we can balance it. Baby, it pours back to you. Baby, oh, don't you be blue. Keep those good old dreams inside coming true, yeah. Now, while here we have a mix knob, that's not always the case. The wet and dry can oftentimes be reflected by multiple different sliders. In Fruity Reverb, we have dry and wet as their own sliders. Baby, it pours back to you. But no matter the setup, you can always achieve the same thing. Going down to the left here, we have pre-delay. Pre means before, and delay means delay. So when we have a reverb, there's already a certain amount of delay generally set into the reverb to account for the size of the room and how long it's going to take for the first reflections to leave, bounce off the walls, and get back to you. This, however, generally happens so quickly that it seems instantaneous. What a pre-delay will do is help move those back farther. And the reason we might want to do this is for clarity. Reverb will wash out and muddy up almost anything you put it on. So if I want clarity in that dynamic enunciation of this vocal, then I want the reverb to react to that enunciation after it's already happened. So I've chosen a decent pre-delay time, and now I'll give you an A-B. Baby, it pours back to you. 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 You should be able to hear a little bit of clarity in the one with the pre-delay. Now, creating this pre-delay actually creates depth. In about 30 milliseconds, sound can travel 33 feet. And our pre-delay is almost at 30 milliseconds. And therefore, we're creating a perception or the idea that the room that's creating this reverb is 33 feet away from the source signal. And now, while this isn't quite realistic, this creates some depth. Because of this lack of realism, though, it's often a very good idea to line up your pre-delay musically. This gives it a musical element as well as a sense that it belongs. If you want to learn how to calculate this pre-delay time, please click the video above and then come on back as we finish through the rest of this. The next thing we're going to have is decay. What this is going to do is this is going to say how long is our reverb going to ring out. If we cut this time all the way down, we're stuck more with what's called early reflections and not so much of the late reflections. So if we take a listen, I'll go 100% on the mix so we can start really hearing what these effects are doing. Baby, it pours back to you. Okay, long decay. Baby, it pours back to you. Somewhere in the middle where we might use it. Baby, it pours back to you. Perfect. Now, you can think of this decay as how reflective and how large a room is. The more materials and the more times sound hits a material, along with how absorptive that material is, decides how quickly that sound dissipates and stops reflecting back and forth, reaching your ears as a reverb. Making these decays extremely long pushes the boundaries of reality and makes for really cool and really great effects and sound design. If we look in our verb here, it's going to be called time. And as I move this time control, you'll see our decay in a visual representation getting lower or longer. The next thing we're going to have, which is something that you should learn and know well with reverbs, is called damping. Damping is the reduction of amplitude of an oscillation. Sound is an oscillating wave. You get positive and negative pressure oscillating back and forth, hitting your ears, being picked up by your eardrums as sound. This damping is done by frictional or other resistive forces. Think of acoustical treatment and other obstacles in a room that the sound is hitting and reflecting off of. Now, while you might have an item that can absorb high frequencies, when you hit that item, you might get sound bouncing in different directions. That will instead be called diffusion. But the actual property of that high-end absorption from that item is considered damping. So if we look here, we have our frequency, and this is going to decide where we place our shelf. If you don't know what a shelf looks like, we'll take a look inside our EQ here, and that's going to be a shelf. So if we had a shelf at 4K, like we do in the Valhalla Vintage verb, it would look something like this. We don't know what the Q is, which would change how quickly this happens, but we shouldn't be mixing with our eyes anyways. We should be mixing with our ears. So what this is going to do is it's not actually going to EQ the sound, but it'll actually change the amount of reflections in these frequency ranges. Where an EQ would just turn down the mass amount of reflections, this is actually going to turn down the amount of the reflections rather than the volume of the amount of reflections, if that makes sense. So if we give this a listen, baby, it pours back to you. Baby, oh, don't you be blue. Keep those good old dreams inside coming true, yeah. I boosted it. You should have heard some air come in on the top. Got a lot brighter. I've moved this frequency down. So now when I turn this high shelf back down, it should become a lot darker. Baby, it pours back to you. Baby, oh, don't you be blue. Keep those good old dreams inside coming true, yeah. Okay. And this damping will always and can always be done for your high and low frequencies. If I come to our verb here, I have a damping option on the left where I can control the high and low frequencies with two different shelf options. The low one looks a little bit more like a cutoff, but it's not a complete cutoff like the EQ here. Looks like a shelf with a really long Q. If we go to our fruity reverb here, though, you'll notice we have a damping option here, which is for the high frequencies. We have a crossover, which is going to choose where the bass damping happens, right here. And in this damping option here on the right, you'll actually see that we're choosing where the damping's happening rather than how much. Now, something I want you to notice here is when I hover over this bass option, in the top left of FL Studio, it says bass multiplier. And we're at 100%, so we can go above or below that. And if we come over to Valhalla Vintage verb, it's the same thing. We're at 1.5 times our bass multiplier. This means our bass frequencies, instead of being tamed, are going to come in at 1.5 times the original amount. Now, I'm not entirely sure why the bass frequencies are like this and the high frequencies are not. However, it's my assumption that it's because the bass frequencies are less reflective. And while it's true that low frequencies travel farther, if you'll notice, if you're standing next to somebody with earbuds in, you'll hear the high frequencies in their earbuds before you hear the low frequencies. And this is due to the way high frequencies reflect, while low frequencies kind of sort of engulf. It's kind of like the idea of hearing the bass outside of a club. You hear the bass because the bass travels through the walls easier, while the higher frequencies reflect more, which means they bounce off the wall rather than going through the wall. Now, with this concept in mind, it makes sense to me that you lose a lot more bass during the reverberation process than you do high end. And you may want to make up for this by multiplying the reflectiveness of the bass using a bass multiplier. Now, more of this bass means a warmer or darker sound, while more high end means a brighter sound like we had just heard. If we give this a listen, and while this can be a lot for the low end, we can always come in afterwards with a bit of an EQ to clean it up. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is room size. Now, room size determines a few things. Room size determines the actual cluster of your early reflections, as well as how long they take to initially get to you. This is much like a bat's sonar. However, much unlike a bat, if you use this sound to try and see and travel through a room, you'll probably run into the wall. Now, while our senses aren't acute enough to be able to make the same judgment our eyes can when we're looking in a room, we still get a sense of that room through these early reflections that are decided by the size of the room. Other things that the size of a room determine is frequency buildup, aka room modes, and reflection density. A bigger room is going to be less dense, and a smaller room is going to be more dense and generally bring out more room tones. This can also affect how long it takes for frequency buildups. This longer buildup can create a slower attack to the delay. Now, while this is usually decided by one knob, which would be a size knob, if we look in vintage Verb, it's decided by two knobs. We have a size and an attack for the shape of our room. So if we take a listen to the room size, I'll turn on our diffusion as well as turn our room size and attack down, and then we'll increase the room size and listen to what happens. Let's make these reflective properties a little bit more moderate. Perfect. And then we'll increase the size. As you can see, there was less frequency buildup when we turned the size up. So again, AB. Okay, and then our attack, we'll AB that as well. Pretty crazy, but if we only add a little bit of it, some pretty cool stuff. So the next thing we're going to have is diffusion. Now, I gave you the example earlier of damping, how you can have something that's going to absorb frequencies. And I stated how we aren't talking about how stuff could bounce off that object, but how that object actually absorbs sound. Well, now we're no longer talking about how that object absorbs sound. We're talking about how sound bounces off that object. When you have a very parallel room, you get frequency buildups like you could hear when we had a smaller size of the room. And what diffusion does, diffusion is like adding in a bookcase with a bunch of books. You got your bed, you got stuff on the walls, some crazy art popping out of the walls, or you have acoustical treatment using diffusers, which you'll see in studios where it's got all the little blocks pointing different directions. And all of this is going to make your sound reflections less predictable and wash over more than build up in a specific frequency range. So we'll decrease the size of this. We'll bring back that tonality from all the buildup, and then we'll increase the diffusion on our reverb. And now you'll notice we have two options for diffusion. We have our early reflections and late reflections. If we turn up diffusion on the early reflections, we'll lose our sense of the room. As the reflections become more confusing, it's harder to actually sense the shape and sense a sort of placement in that space. This still, however, can sound pretty good. So if we give this a listen, we'll turn up the diffusion on the early reflections, and then we'll do the late.
Baby, it pours back to you. Baby, oh, don't you be blue.
We'll do an A-B.
Baby, it pours back to you.
Got a real strong sense of the room. B.
Baby, it pours back to you.
It's more of a wash. We get less sense of where we are. Again, A-B without me talking.
Baby, it pours back to you. Baby, it pours back to you.
Right? And now to hear more of what's actually happening and going on, we'll boost the late reflections. So we'll turn it up.
Baby, it pours back to you. Baby, oh, don't you be blue. Keep those good old.
Okay, A-B.
Baby, it pours back to you. Baby, it pours back to you.
We didn't quite get rid of that buildup, but you can still hear the difference. Again, A-B. Longer decay.
Baby, it pours back to you. Baby, it pours back to you.
Somewhere in the middle.
Baby, it pours back to you.
Right? Diffusion. Now, if we look at our verb here, we're going to just see a diffusion knob. If we look at fruity reverb, we're just going to see our diffusion knob. This is going to group together your late and early reflections and or control them in their own ways on your different reverbs. The controls will never look the same, but they'll all generally be the same. The next thing we have is modulation. Now, if you look on the modulation here, we have rate and depth. What modulation is going to actually do is it's generally going to control the time or the decay of your reverb. And it's going to do this using an LFO or a low frequency oscillator, which basically means anything under 20 hertz, hence low frequency. It'll generally control this in a sine wave type of style. And rate is going to be how quickly this happens, while depth is going to be how much it happens. And what this does is this can help break up those buildups and other weird anomalies that are happening in the room and the reverb you're making by creating variation. I've turned the depth all the way up here, and with the depth all the way up, we'll give it a listen at a low rate, and then you'll see what happens when we turn it up to a high rate. Okay, low rate, you didn't hear a lot because the reverb is just slowly riding this wave. Now, when I turn this up, though, what you're going to hear is going to sound like something out of a horror story. Somebody ate too many mushrooms. And this could be great for creating effects for specific uses. You would more use this moderately, something like that, to help break things up by increase the size of the room. It all comes together to create a nice complementary reverb. If we look in Fruity Reverb 2, we have our modulation and our speed. However, in our verb here, you don't really see a modulation option. Now, the final thing we have is our EQ. And this is going to be a simple high cut also known as a low pass, or a low cut, also known as a high pass. So if I had a lot of these bass frequencies, and I wanted to clean it up, I could move that up. If I want something brighter, but I don't want that sharpness at the top end, I can bring this down. Now we've got a whole different feel going. If you want a visual representation, we can go to Reverb, and we can see here, got our low cut and our high cut. Now, speaking on different reverbs, if you'll notice in Vintage Verb, our early and late reflections only show up as diffusion options. In our verb, however, our early reflections and our late reflections, reverb, show up as separate options. Also, our fruity reverb, early and late reflections. So if I load up a nice chamber here, looking at this and remembering our early reflections tell us what the room is. If we have them both, we have a nice reverb putting us somewhere with a good tail to it. Right? But what if we take it away? We're going to lose our room entirely. Right? Bring it back. We'll A-B it. Strong sense of the room. No sense of the room. And the same thing, we have the reverb we can control separately. So we'll completely take that away and just leave our early reflections. Now we have a sense of the room only. This can be great when you don't have space and you don't want to muddy up a mix and you want to give something a sense that it's somewhere. However, as humans, we don't like extremely absorptive rooms. It kind of freaks us out. So keep that in mind while you're using this. Speaking on these early reflections, as I said, define the shape and size of a room. Now, we can change our size here, but something cool we can do in our verb is we can actually change the shape. We can do this by changing variations. As you can see and watch, our clusters here are going to change for our early reflections. Now, whether or not this actually completely changes room size or just places you somewhere else in the room and places the speakers somewhere else in the room, creating different reflections, I'm not entirely sure. However, it's a great way to change the sense and feel of where you're at. One of the options and things you'll see in most all reverbs that we haven't talked about is emulation options. So if we give a drop down, we've got halls, room, chamber, plate, as well as some other crazy non-realistic reverbs. If we go to Valhalla Vintage Verb, same thing. These will create different feelings in your sound. If you want to know about these more in depth, click the video above. And to see a depiction of this, if we actually change back to our verb, you can see as I change the reverb type that these clusters for our early reflections are going to change because early reflections represent the room, and changing the room type, should change the early reflections. And there you have it. You'll see other types of emulations and reverbs as well. If we go back to Valhalla Vintage Verb, you can see we have colors, 1970s, 1980s, and now. Now it's going to be more modern, probably less tube saturation, being more clear and bright rather than warm and dark. And while we're on the topic of all these separate options, Fruity Reverb actually has something really cool. Fruity Reverb has a mid-side option. If you go to the side option, it leaves everything in the middle alone, and it plays more with the outside. This can be great for widening a mix and leaving the center, amongst other things. We also have a stereo separation tool, which will help push it more separated one direction or the other. So if you really wanted, you can have a mono reverb. And that's about that. Today, you learned how to use damping, diffusion, decay, size, attack, and more. We learned that reverb types play a huge difference. And if you want to learn more about that, again, video above. And we learned that using reverbs is a great way to create specific properties of a room for placing your sounds within or creating some cool effects. So if you liked this video, please like this video. If you have any comments, please comment. I always appreciate a subscribe. It's Warren with Scale Audio, and adios.